it's good to see you today and to talk about the topic of interpretation and my understanding of interpretation. So interpretation has been enjoyed by a considerable popularity in recent years all over Europe and also all over the globe, and most probably also in the countries of the region it is unknown notion. With regards to the constantly increasing mobility of labour force and opening of the labour market, it seems important for educational institutions engaged in translation training in all over Europe and the world to risk to the challenge and prepare to fulfil the needs of society. So my understanding of community interpreting is usually referred to as a special type of oral translation facilitating access to public services by mediating between service users and service providers who do not share the same language, despite the fact that it is a rapidly growing field, especially in countries with expanding foreign-based workforce. We are witnessing a certain divergence in its perception. The variance is not only in a number of different names under which it can be profound, such as public service interpreting in the UK, cultural interpreting, even as far as United States of America. So the liaison interpreting work and the context of interpretation all over the world, which includes the dialogue interpreting and ad hoc, triangular face and bidirectional or biliteral interpreting. So according to Gentile 1996 by Carr 1997, but also in the scope also different interpretation of the terms in most cases reflects situation needs, traditions and local specifics. It is possible to define the generally accepted common features of the phenomena. So community interpreting is sometimes disguised from other types of interpreting for the context in which it is employed. It is understood a kind of interpreting that takes place in neighbourhoods and community agencies and is performed by amateurs or unpaid volunteers, as I've actually done that myself over the years, often perceived as non-professional interpreters. It is related to stimulations in which non-native speakers are aided by native speakers, but also non-native speakers in their communication with the providers of various public services. The setting where communication takes place includes, I can give you an example of various settings where it takes place, for example in hospitals, in doctors' offices, in attorneys or the courts' offices, social welfare, housing agencies, employment agencies, police stations. It is obvious that the typical clients are mostly migrant workers and their families and members of specific ethnic groups in large cities. Another characteristic feature of community interpreting is the degree of formality, and also not just formality but also the informality in the interpreting activities. Instead of interpreting a speech to a large audience, a community interpreter works in a more interactive atmosphere, often with a dialogic structure. This approach stresses the dialogic setting regardless of the given situation that you may probably be in. So whether this is in, for example, in hospitals, public services, agencies, police departments, therefore it is sometimes labelled as dialogue interpreting. I mean, that's what I look at. I see it that way, as dialogue interpreting, compared to other types of interpreting. Unprofessional community interpreter can also serves as a guide, advisor, or a social mediator. It's often spontaneous. It's often spontaneous and face-to-face interaction. Predestines him to function as a client's advocate and a helping hand. So community interpreting is also distinguished from other types of interpreting by the fact that no equipment is used for the communication. That's one thing. Depending on the circumstances, it can take the form of either consecutive or simultaneous interpreting as chocotage, but on principle in the presence of all persons involved, albeit sometimes over the telephone. So in that case, there is consensus in the literature that the community interpreter is required to be competent in the relevant languages and cultures, as Jining 2007 actually addresses, and in the communicative process of everyday and domain knowledge of an institutionalized communicative situation. The domain knowledge is often equated with terminological knowledge, but recently has a ISO included norms and conventions in legal discourse. So as a consequence of the lack of a conceptual framework, opinions on the specific forms of communicating, community interpreting significantly vary from author to author, from country to country. The most controversial issue is whether community interpreting should also include such specific fields as court interpreting or conference interpreting, as Rhoda Roberts 2002 actually stresses. So we argue that in community interpreting differs from court interpreting and conference interpreting. In community interpreting, there are different objectives, different types of parties involved, different number of parties, different discourse used, and it's all used different mode of interpreting, and differences in the directionality of interpreting. Several authors include court interpreting into community interpreting. Community interpreters, however, behave not only a different role compared to court interpreters do, but also have a different degree of responsibility. Therefore, as ad hoc service providers, they are often related to the professional interpreting services rendered by whoever is immediately available, such as medical hospital staff, family members, including children, or even other people, or other patients. So court interpreters, on the other hand, are in most countries specialised professionals, offering assistance not only to defence or prosecution, but they are also active prior to the case itself. So the fulfilment of his role requires an understanding by the interpreter of the complexities of the task to be performed and the fundamental ethical principles and standards prescribed by judicial authorities. In the case of court interpreting, the principle of neutrality and detachment is taken for granted. Accurately, impartiality, confidentiality, and proficiency and demeanour belong to the major quality requirements for court interpreters. So, contrary to the situation in some countries where court interpreting keeps a low status, For example, in parts of East Europe, a demand for a higher level of professionalism can be observed. According to effective legislation, some routine jobs of community interpreters are only reserved to qualified professionals appointed by the Ministry of Justice, in addition to a court legal interpreting that has the highest status non-court contexts such as interviews, police department, custom officers, or ceremonies at local registration office also require sworn or official certified interpreters. All these services have specialized interpretation, translation for official purposes. Other types of interpreting are more informal and do not require highly qualified interpreters. So the profession of community interpreter as a format of occupation has no tradition in society, in contrast to the situation in, for example, Northern America, where it is a non-profit organisation working under the name Critical Link. For example, Canada puts a lot of effort into promoting the establishment of standards which guide the practice of community interpreters, encouraging and sharing research in the field of community interpretation, adding to the discussion about the education and training requirements for community interpreters. Advocating for the provision of professional community interpreting services by social, legal, healthcare institutions, raising awareness about community interpreting as a profession.